Welcome, Gerard, and I've got your PowerPoint here just in case um, we need to use it, but hopefully
can you see this? It's coming up, I think.
we can see that, absolutely. So thank you very much. So if you'd just like to take it away, that's working well.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everyone to a bit of a talk about the concept of Islandian sovereignty. As Andrew said, my name is Gerard. I am Dutch by origin. I spent the first half of my professional career in East and Southern Africa in development programs, but particularly remote rural development and rebuilding and reconstruction programs after war. That brought me by a strange detour to the whole question of how remote communities negotiate or deal with or engage with powers that be in capital cities. And arguably, if you're in the north of Mozambique, to take an example that's a bit in the news as well, as far away from the capital city, Maputo, in not just in physical distance, but also in political distance and interest, as many island communities are. I came to New Zealand in the mid-2000s to do a PhD that was supposed to be a 3 or 4 year plan, but as many people who come to work in New Zealand or study in New Zealand discover, the place grows on you, as they say, very quickly, and I never left. So that's a warning for anyone who takes up the offer to come and work and study in New Zealand. Okay, what I would like to do today is discuss this whole idea of Islandian sovereignty for non-sovereign island territories. So that seems to be a bit of a contradiction, but I hope to explain that. Before I go into the actual content, I would like to point out that Andrew, his colleagues at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada, have been working for a number of years now, collaborating for a number of years on this issue of island studies. And 2 students at the University of Prince Edward Island who I would like to acknowledge, Wendy Collette and Fiona Steele. They have been making all sorts of suggestions and giving examples with regard to Islandian sovereignty, what that looks like in practice. So I'd like to see a bit of an acknowledgement for student contributions to the work of research. What I would like to do is 3 things. First, explain a little bit what I think are non-sovereign island territories as colonial legacies, leftovers, echoes of a colonial past. That's quite brief. Then I will go into quite some detail into what I think are 6 strategies of this Islandian sovereignty of these non-sovereign island territories with regards to their colonial metropoles. And the last issue is a question I would like to pose to people listening and then see if we can have a bit of a conversation. Because the question for me is, to what extent do these strategies that colonial or former colonial overseas territories apply to kind of get an increased autonomy vis-a-vis their colonial metropoles? To what extent do those strategies also apply to what I could call nearby island communities, like, for example, Shetland Islands that are not 5,000 kilometers away from the metropolitan power, closer, nearer by the mainland. Colonial history may not apply as such to many of these islands, and yet the relationship between these island communities and the metropole, in your case London, may or may not differ fundamentally from, say, Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific, to name most extreme opposite example. First, then, these non-sovereign island territories that are colonial legacies. There's about 50 of them, depending on who's counting. The UN, to start it off with, has a list of the Committee of 24 has a list of 17 territories that need to be decolonized. 15 of those are islands. So that's the starting point when we talk about islands as colonial legacies. 7 of these former colonial powers are listed here: UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, France, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. Now, in addition to these 15 to be decolonised far-flung islands, there are another 22 to about 30 that are overseas territories associated with the EU. There is an association of these overseas countries and territories called OCTA that has 22 members, listed them here, and there's a number of associate members listed next, again between 22 and 30 countries, island territories. Then, of course, if we look at the Pacific, that's quite a different dynamic to some extent. The US has has constitutional bonds with 7 Pacific territories, and I include Hawaii in that. Come to that later, but there's a good reason to consider Hawaii colonial legacy in the US context. New Zealand has constitutional bonds with 4 Pacific territories. Most people would know about the Cook Islands, Niue, Tokelau. But Samoa is another interesting, has an interesting relationship with New Zealand. When Samoa became independent from New Zealand in '62, they signed a treaty of friendship. And in the treaty of friendship, Samoans are given preferential access to New Zealand, for example, and New Zealand has assumed responsibilities for defense for Samoa. So the relationship between Samoa and New Zealand is a special one as well. Australia has, in a very different fashion, special relationships with 3 territories: the Norfolk Island community, Cocos Island, and Christmas. I'll come to that later on. The key thing to start off with is that many of these colonial legacy islands seem to be rejecting a classic, what one would call a Westphalian sovereignty, full independence. And arguably, the year 1983 is an important turning point here. St. Kitts and Nevis were the last island colonial territory that decolonised, became a sovereign independent state. And interestingly, in the same year, there was a referendum in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. People were given a choice: full sovereignty or free association with the US were among the options. And people chose not full sovereignty, but free association with the USA, the former colonial power. So the mid-80s were this turning point where basically decolonization stopped. The question then is, why? What was happening? There's a number of comparative research programs that have been carried out in the 2010s. McElroy and Perry are an important one. They compared about 55 sovereign and non-sovereign island states, and their findings were quite dramatic. If you average it out, the GDP on non-sovereign island territories was about twice that of island territories that became sovereign. Another indicator would be infant mortality, again, twice as high in sovereign island territories, former colonies that became independent, as compared to non-sovereign territories, those that remained in a constitutional bond with the colonial metropole. I think what I find interesting is in the 2010s, this relationship between these non-sovereign island territories and metropolitan powers became more of a subject of study. I think we should credit Gottfried Baldacchino to take a leading role in that. He points out that these, by his definition, subnational island jurisdictions, SNIJs, a bit of a fortunate acronym perhaps, but these subnational island jurisdictions, they have a very peculiar relationship with the metropole. It is different from, or they are different from other subnational members of the state, provinces, states, municipalities, etc. So islands have a peculiar relationship as a subnational jurisdiction. Adam Gridahoy is another person I think we should credit for a lot of thinking on this non-sovereign island territories, and he elaborates thinking around how island territories negotiate the binaries between independence and dependence. A lot of interesting thinking by Adam on the fact that many small sovereign nations also have a limit to their autonomy. They need to pay heed to what larger neighboring states would say. So the concept of an Westphalian sovereignty should not be taken as an absolute. And with Séverine Blaise, I came up with see if this is a better way for the microphone. Does this help? A little bit, I hope.
Yeah, that works fine.
Okay. With Séverine Blaise, I worked on a number of Pacific territories, and we came to a sort of a model of what we call an Islandian sovereignty. Yeah, so go ahead.
No, sorry, Gerard, it was just you faded out for a second there, but you've come back now. So.
The question for people like yourselves in the North Atlantic is that in addition to these, let's say, 50 colonial legacy islands, there are of course many others, other islands communities that have more of a historic background to their relationship to the metropoles. Much research, as I said, has focused on these colonial legacy islands, and 6 strategies that I will be detailing shortly of these islands in dealing with the metropoles is all based on these former colonial territories. Again, Baldacchino came up in the 2010s with a long list of these SNIJs, these subnational island jurisdictions. And his book, Island Enclaves of 2010, lists about 120 of them. And we have to think about people like island communities like the Canary Islands, Åland Islands, etc. The question that I would like to discuss with you further on is to what extent are these islands, and the Shetland Islands would be included in this list, are they similar or different from the former colonial island territories? Right. What are these 6 strategies that islands apply to increase their autonomy vis-a-vis the metropolitan powers? The first one I think is important to note is the fact that islanders have voted no to referenda on independence since the mid-80s. There's a whole long list of these that can be studied, but the interesting part of it is that a vast majority in these referendums showed no interest at all in becoming independent states. Votes often were north of 90%, a few exceptions. One interesting example, for example, is the independence referendum in Tokelau, New Zealand overseas territory, when they voted against independence or not even independence, against free association with New Zealand. They wanted to remain be governed by New Zealand. They voted against free association in 2006. And the New Zealand government said, you didn't quite understand the question probably. Let us educate you about what's at stake, and then we vote again next year in 2007. Well, that was done, and the result in 2007 was no different from 2006. So arguably, Tokelauans knew very well what they were voting for. The New Caledonian independence, the Pacific showed a very different pattern with a large number of settlers. The dynamic played out differently. The last referendum in December was a bit of a shambles. The conflict there is clearer, more complex, but overall, the 3 previous referendums showed a no against independence. So voting no is important, but it does not mean that the matter is settled there. I think the second strategy of island communities to increase their autonomy is to say no to sovereignty. full sovereignty, Westphalian sovereignty, but then start negotiating continuously about their status. And that ends up in a situation that we have across the 7 metropolitan powers, is that all their overseas territories have their own relationship with the capital in Europe or in the States or New Zealand or Australia. France has, I think, 13 overseas territories, 12. Each one of them has their own constitutional document, and that changes all the time. New Caledonia, for example, has had 10 different statuses since '46. And the same goes for the other metropolitan powers. Here's an example, a clipping from a newspaper, how Curaçao, one of the Dutch overseas territories, formerly a country in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, so a high degree of autonomy. But Curaçao, are you still having difficulty?
No, listening fine. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Curaçao is one of the 6 Caribbean territories, but it negotiates its own aid package, its own relationship with The Hague in the Netherlands. So the fact that all of these 6 island communities negotiate their own unique aid packages with regard to COVID, again, is evidence that it is controlled, initiated, shaped by the island communities, not by The Hague. I'm quite sure if you're a central government bureaucrat, you would prefer one model and apply that to all 6 island communities. That does not happen. So each island negotiates its own package. And that goes quite far, actually, particularly when it comes to matters that are, let's say, more sensitive. Aside from the fact that New Caledonia is effectively ignoring French labor laws and prosecutions by the say France. A key issue to show this Islandian sovereignty is visible in the issue of same-sex marriages. A number of overseas territories, non-sovereign island territories, if you want, have really seriously resisted decriminalizing or acknowledging same-sex marriages or relationships or engagements. It's a picture from Bermuda a few years ago, and I'd like to focus briefly on American Samoa, an American overseas territory that has refused to acknowledge a Supreme Court ruling that legalizes same-sex marriages. In 2015, the US Supreme Court ruled that this applied across, of course, the nation, and American Samoa has not just resisted, but right now there's a number of very painful issues where American citizens are being put in jail in American Samoa for engaging in illegal sexual behavior. There's an American right now being jailed since 2019 for having had sex with a man in American Samoa. So that's really a strong pushback, and you can see that in Aruba and the other overseas territories as well. So the issue of morality plays a strong role here. But it's not always in a form of a conflict. Sometimes it is carefully negotiated. Another example was in Futuna, a French overseas territory. It's interesting to go back for a moment to the French Constitution, and in this case, the Constitution of 1905. France goes through constitutions quite quickly. Article 2 of the French Constitution says the Republic does not recognize, pay wages to, or subsidize any cult. Very subtle dig at the radical separation between state and church in France. So that's very clear. In 2004, there was another law enacted to reiterate basically this Article 2 and says, cannot show religious symbols or religious clothing when you're working or visiting public places like primary and secondary schools. So no visible crucifixes, keppel, hijabs. This was often referred to as the hijab legislation. No hijab in a public place in France. So that's constitutionally a no-no. To make it very clear, I've taken here a screenshot of that actual law in French. Article 2 of that law of 2004 very explicitly says the present law is applicable, on the islands of Wallis and Futuna. So to make sure there's no misunderstanding, you cannot show publicly, in public spaces, religious symbols or clothing. Well, here we have a picture of a primary school in Wallis and Futuna. I took this photograph in 2016, and I can guarantee you all primary schools are shrines to the Catholic mission. How did it happen? Well, in Wallis and Futuna, the state could not find an opening or an interest for public schools. So the entire public education system in Wallis and Futuna has been contracted out to the Catholic mission. This is a copy of the contract between the left, the French administrator in Wallis and Futuna, and to the right, the bishop of the diocese of Wallis and Futuna. So France, state, radically secular state, has contracted out primary education to the Catholic mission in Wallis and Futuna. And in that sense, it sort of sanctions, it approves not the separation of state and church, but actually the state moving into a space that is explicitly reserved for non-religious actors. So it gets really interesting here. And we see that in different places. And again, this may or may not apply to places, for example, like the Shetland Islands. Another brief example of how islands get away with bending these expectations and rules of the metropole. The 6 Dutch Caribbean territories, some of them are countries, some of them are special municipalities. The Netherlands, the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Europe, has, of course, the euro as its currency. However, Aruba, one of the 6, has its own currency, the florin. Curaçao and St. Martin, too, have joined hands and established yet another currency for their 2 islands. And then the 3 municipalities, the 3 Dutch municipalities in the Caribbean, have decided that they do not want a bar of the euro like the neighboring islands. Or in the case of St. Martin, for example, the other half of the island. These special municipalities decided to use the American dollar as a currency. I'm quite sure there's very few municipalities elsewhere in Europe that get away with printing their own money and having their own local bank, or accepting the money inside their metropolitan powers as a currency. So there's a lot of negotiated space there, much more than you could possibly imagine. The fourth of strategy of these 6 is subnational island jurisdictions, or these non-sovereign island territories, being very good at negotiating extra money flowing in from metropolitan capital city. There's a few numbers here. Wallis and Futuna gets a per capita fiscal transfer of more than $10,000 per person. Palau, that has a compact of free association, a co-fund with the US, is the poor cousin here with only $1,800 per capita. And it varies again a lot. These are numbers from the New Zealand overseas partners, Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau. You see the numbers per capita differ wildly. So again, islands manage to negotiate their own fiscal packages in different ways, or with different levels of success. On top of that, the relationship with the metropolitan power allows islands to access funds for infrastructure development and disaster response. One example of that would be, for example, the airport of St. Helena, South Atlantic, close to $400 million for an airport that has one flight a week. Recently upgraded to 2 flights a week, one to South Africa and one to London. That's a pretty expensive airport that the island community could never afford by itself. After many years of haggling and negotiating, the airport came into being. Interestingly, Tokelau is a similar example in the Pacific, where New Zealand has for years dragged its feet with regard to paying that airstrip. Tokelau has no airstrip, and it has recently been decided that the airstrip will eventually be built in the next few years once the COVID restrictions are lifted. So there's patterns recurring there. Islands get infrastructure that they could never pay for themselves by negotiating with their metropolitan powers. A fifth strategy of an island community to negotiate and expand its autonomy is signing or withdrawing from all sorts of international agreements in ways that may be awkward for the metropolitan power, but work very well for the island itself. I watched the webinar by Professor Collins from the University of the Faroe Islands. He just explains a little bit, and I found it really interesting how the Faroe Islands withdrew from the European Union, but was able to sign up to be a member of the UEFA. Again, an island community that is able to kind of wiggle its way into a position that gives it much more autonomy than other subnational entities. Very common other example of these islands having agreements or wiggling their way out of international agreements that are beneficial to them, of course, are the offshore banking businesses in many island territories. But also, and this is an example from Niue, where the Niue Island Council makes deals and agreements with China, has a clear presence of China in the island community. Again, there's no municipality in New Zealand that would be able to sign deals with the Chinese government for infrastructure development. Niue does. Islands, in a different context, effectively, very cleverly offers of Chinese development aid to put pressure on New Zealand to provide more per capita aid to the Cook Islands. So again, the island community is very good at negotiating. And the last point, the sixth strategy would be with regard to the communication network around the island. I think we're seeing increasing attempts by island communities to replace what's called a hub and spoke network with a point-to-point or a reticular network of communication. Most islands have this hub and spoke model of infrastructure communication. There's the metropolitan center, a hub, and then there's only one way out of the island towards the rest of the world, that is via the metropolitan territory. I think we're seeing increasing examples of islands trying to develop a sort of a network, point-to-point network of communication and transport. I think we should credit Adriano Favola and Lara Giordana in Turin for developing this idea further. They've written some interesting pieces there. This is what a reticular or a point-to-point network would look like. The island in the center here, the island and in the edges here have multiple connections to the outside world. They do not need to go to the center. A few examples of what that looks like, because this is a point on which many island communities struggle. This is a map of Wallis and Futuna, here in the middle with the circle. As it is right now, there's only one way out of the island. If you want to leave Wallis, you have to go to, and Nandi is given as a link here, but that's a bit of a fake. The only way out of Wallis is via Noumea. Even if there are historic relationships with islands around Wallis and Futuna, in terms of cultural relationships, trade relationships, what the colonial history has done has sort of tried to cut off those relationships that surround Wallis. And this is a news clipping at the start of the pandemic, which is a bit unfortunate again, but the Island Council of Wallis has supported the launch of a new airline. And what you see here is that they wanted a direct connection to Samoa, which they have much more of a closer connection, and French Tahiti. So the islands make really big efforts and invest in getting a point-to-point network, a reticular network, and not be dependent on one door to the world. Another example of that would be Norfolk Island, and obviously it's territory of Australia. This is a map of the connections of Norfolk Island with the rest of the world. There is /was a flight to New Zealand. It's actually the closest by place as well. Air New Zealand decided, was running this line, this connection to Norfolk Island. When they pulled out because they couldn't make enough money on it, the Island Council said, we will put money in re-establishing that connection, that flight with New Zealand. And they pointed to the long-time cultural connections and social connections between Aucklanders, particularly, and Norfolk Island. They spent a lot of money on it. And it worked for the first 3 months. And then with a sort of a dagger in the back, the newly established Norfolk Island Airlines had to can those flights to New Zealand because the Australian federal government raised the departure tax from Norfolk Island by 10% and thereby made the commercial case for this flight between Norfolk Island and New Zealand impossible. So this is a bit of an awful example of metropolitan powers really opposing the diversification of a communication network around an island. No more direct flights for the time being because Canberra does not like it. Right, that brings me to the end of my talk, I would say. For those in the room, I think the question I would like to put on the table, whether you recognize something of these 6 strategies applied by, we'll call for the time being, colonial legacy island communities, the far-flung imperial colonial islands. Do they also apply to island communities that are nearer to these metropolitan cities, like, for example, the Shetland Islands? Just to remind us of the 6 strategies: saying no to independence, negotiate your constitutional status with the metropole continuously, rephrase it, rework it every 3, 4, or 5, or 10 years, bending the rules strongly, securing more money from the metropole than any other subnational entity gets, sign international agreements that may embarrass or be awkward for the metropole, but do it anyway, and really work towards, that's the 6th, getting your own communication networks around you. I have a few ideas, and those were provided to me by some of the students in Canada, most interestingly, with regards to Shetland. But before I show that, I think I would leave it open to a conversation. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Wow. Okay. Excellent. Yes, some of these, some of your 6 ideas there do ring bells. Of course, there's the question of sort of the level of autonomy that you need to have before you can exercise Islandian sovereignty, if you know what I mean. There has to be a certain amount of the ability to make decisions, to be able to bend the rules and things. But there are things there that, you know, as they ring bells. The reticular connections, sort of making connections with other places in your own, for your own purposes. I suppose another term for that is paradiplomacy. So, you know, Shetland being involved when the island games, or making connections with the Faroe Islands, inviting Faroese politicians over to to talk about the COVID situation there, and also just actually coming across to talk about island autonomy, sort of organised by Shetland Council, you know, inviting a very eloquent Faroese politician who was on the radio and saying, well, why aren't you exercising more autonomy? This is what we do.
Perfect example. Great.
Yeah. So and that went down very well. Also negotiating the relationship, well, within the parameters of which the Scottish councils, island councils, are able to do that. There was the Our Islands, Our Futures campaign, which has led to the Island Act and the Island Plan, and to quite a large dollop of money being given by the two governments to the islands. So that really was about renegotiating the relationship between the island councils and government, sort of you know, take it seriously, this is what we'd like, please, and actually being written into the Act that the island councils can seek further autonomy. You know, well, they could anyway, but it's sort of written into the Act that the right is there for the islands to do that. So that's part of that, and also this campaign in Shetland, instigated by the council last year to seek more autonomy. So that's, you know, that's definitely in there. What was something else about it? Oh yeah, there's a big debate at the moment about fixed links in Shetland, digging tunnels, basically, again through this.
Like the Faroe example.
Exactly, and the Faroe Islands, they stand as the example that Shetland is trying to emulate in so many ways. But as far as tunnels is concerned, there's been a big move with the local MSP and the local MP holding an online debate just last weekend, open to anybody who was interested in Shetland to take part in that. And they also invited a Norwegian civil engineer and a civil engineer based in Scotland to discuss fixed links and the building of these tunnels and connecting the islands in the Faroese manner. And now the campaign has been taken to the Scottish Government and Westminster to try and get these funded. And I'm sure Shetland could actually fund one or two of the tunnels, but anyway, the argument is, why should we? So it's it's national government, our metropolitan government, that should be financing these things. And I see Frank has got his hand up as well. So by the way, Frank.
Question from Adele as well, if I say that correctly.
Yeah, that's good. That was a fascinating summary of revision of that for these island institutions. I like your 6 points at the end. I would add a 7th point. It isn't a case of actually bending the rules. There are cases where we just simply ignore them, and the relative isolation, the relative distance from metropolitan centres and from government means that you can say, yeah, I know we should do that by the law, but we don't give a shit. We're not doing that. And so I would like to say, to ask you about what do you see, if you distill all that myriad of different approaches, yeah, and you said there are lots of different strategies and different flavors and nuances as it goes through there. Do you see any cohesive link in the way that island institutions are using those colonial links to actually further their own decolonization? So I'm saying that they're taking their hat off to these things, but using the force against itself and saying, you know, you've said, okay, you made the case with the Supreme Court in the States, for example, but France is a good example of extreme centralism, but actually a lot of, oops, are we losing them? But a lot of the activity in the the French protectorates actually being quite different culturally and legally from what goes on in France?
Oh yeah, absolutely, Frank. Well, the example of the schools being run by the Catholic mission is anathema in a French context. I mean, you can't even you get fired if you walk into a French primary school with a crucifix visible. That's a no-no. And then have priests run the school with all the, I mean, that's absolutely incredible. What you call ignoring the rules, yes. The question is on in what fields do you do it? Could you do it with regard to, for example, taxation or regulation? Let's try to apply it on the Shetland Islands. Could Shetland Islands do what the Cook Islands and Niue have done, set up offshore banking systems that basically make it very easy for people to whitewash illegal money? Maybe you can set up, I don't know, making stuff up, a sort of a cryptocurrency exchange and just become a haven for all sorts of free money. Would you do that? Or when would the Scottish or the UK authorities intervene? What would be points where you're breaking or ignoring the rules?
Well, a good example of that for me, which is part of my question about the levels of confrontation rather than subversion that island states have. For a good example from me would be locally the barter economy. The plumber comes, I pay them in cash.
Mm-hmm.
The government doesn't know he's been paid. My old car has fallen to bits. I conveniently forget to renew my tax disc on that because I'm only ever use it twice a year to go to, tavern and so on and so forth. There are lots and lots of examples without naming people and actually, highlighting them to the attention of the authorities. I could write a book on this in terms of that informal, that non-formal economy that just says, well, yeah, okay, you have to do that if you're in Glasgow or London or whatever else, but nah, here, forget it.
But Frank, it's important, Frank, to well, in my way of thinking anyway, if we try to understand the politics of it, to differentiate between what you as an individual do and get away with, because I guess that would apply to many people in rural New Zealand as well. If you live in a remote town, you can drive into the nearest town, and the one copper in town is not going to ticket you because he's married to your sister. I mean, look, it's not going to happen. But that is individuals sort of escaping the scrutiny of the state. The question would be more interesting is, at what level would island councils or island authorities be able to bend the rules and say, we are going to not raise or collect taxes that we are supposed to be collecting? Is that something that is possible in Shetland?
Well, they don't raise central taxes, so they raise rates.
You pay GST, I presume, or what is it, VAT in the UK?
Yeah, they don't collect that centrally as well. You'd have to have some sort of new status, and it has been discussed whether, say, Shetland should go for the Isle of Man status and raise all taxes, and therefore also be responsible for paying all bills as well. But if you had direct control over all taxation, then you could start, not taxing various people that you felt were bringing other benefits to the island.
Andrew, this is where you would sort of have the authority to do it. What I was thinking of in response to the examples is like, what happens if you would say, look, the cost of living in Shetland is much higher than it is on the mainland? I presume that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
And the islanders would say, you know what, we refuse in the shops, we refuse to charge people the value-added tax, government surcharge tax. So everything becomes like 12% cheaper or 15% cheaper, whatever it is. So at some point, the tax department is going to come down like a ton of bricks on all businesses that refuse to collect the government tax. That could be an act of defiance. Supported by the local island council. Say, look,
mm-hmm.
we aren't going to arrest or fine these business owners because they're helping to keep the cost of living low, because the central government refuses to make sure that we have access to these goods for a reasonable price.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we're far away, but we're not that far away. I think people would, if we lived in the middle of the Pacific, perhaps, yeah, I think there's not much appetite for that sort of activity at the moment. But
I think there's another example that maybe is worth sharing on gay marriage, for example, or like the Dutch island territories have been dragging their feet on this for what, better part of 2 decades almost. Right now, 2 of the islands have said, okay, we will acknowledge same-sex relationships, and people can register, not get married, but they can register their same-sex relationship, right? So it's legal. Unfortunately, we cannot find a single civil servant in the bureaucracy of Aruba and Curacao who was willing to sign the book on this matter. So if you're a gay couple, you can walk into the government buildings or the local island council buildings and say, look, I would like to register my relationship. And none of the civil servants is willing to do it. There's a lot of debate around that. There's community pressure on these civil servants. You shall not cooperate. But it's a form of resistance that has the authorities in The Hague scratch their heads. So the government has said, yes, we will, but then the civil servants refuse. What are you going to do as a prosecutor in The Hague? Put all the civil servants on the island in the dock? I mean, and it's a thing that matters a lot to the very religious communities. Mm-hmm. And what doesn't make it better, of course, is a lot of upper middle class white folk going to these islands and then say, I would like to register my same-sex relationship on this island because it's also the Netherlands. Well, then the whole decolonization comes onto the table again. Why do these white folk come in and impose their values? And whatever we think from the perspective of the islanders and many islanders, that is unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's
a violent confrontation.
It's interesting. The examples that you gave are all they show conservative attitudes in the island communities. Do you have any examples of the opposite of island communities being sort of ahead of the curve and wanting to do things or that the central government is loath to do? Or is it always a sort of the island communities are conservative in their attitudes?
I'm not sure whether relaxing controls over banking is progressive or conservative. Niue has 1,500 inhabitants. At one point during the scandals on these Panama Papers and all that, they had 4,000 banking licenses operating from the island. Unknown numbers of people were involved in this. Is that progressive or not? I have no idea, but it's basically thumping their noses at New Zealand authorities, and New Zealand getting hammered by the global authorities on banking. Like, how can you let this happen in a place that nominally is under your jurisdiction? People have New Zealand passports, they operate under New Zealand law. Doesn't New Zealand law apply there? Well, I don't know. To give another example, on a UK territory, I'm not entirely sure how this works out, but on the islands of St. Helena and 3 South Atlantic, they seem to avoid enforcing UK legislation with regard to management of marine resources, saying the community's fishing rights go first. And any legislation you have in the UK about what can and cannot be taken home may apply in the UK, but it doesn't apply here. It's the community eats first. Something also that, by the way, happens in Christmas Island, where the Australian government prohibits collecting more than an X amount of fish per day. And the islanders are saying, well, see if you can catch me. So I'm not sure whether that sort of politics is progressive or not. But I would agree with you that when it comes to morality, there is a trend that would say islands are more conservative in values and clash in that sense with urban or highly urbanized values. But then again, maybe it's also an echo of, I don't know, Brexit, the United States, where the contrast between remote, rural, and urban communities in terms of social mores and values is cause for drifting apart in society or conflict.
Yeah, very interesting.
What's Adela's question?
Yes, that's what I was going to. This could be the last one. Well, it's a comment, I think. So fascinating. So she's enjoyed the talk, as we all did. What immediately came to mind for me, Ray, point 6, around local energy production, attempting to replace a hub and spoke distribution model with a P2P model. Various regulatory and legislative barriers remain to make that a challenge. Adele has worked in the in that industry in Orkney, so I think well I don't know. It's not a question. It's more just a comment.
Is she able to comment on it or not, or is it just is it not possible?
Is she still there? Let's just have a. Yes, she's still there. Maybe Adele. Maybe you'd like to add a little bit more to your comment, and then we'll make that the final part of the talk, because it must be quite late with you, Gerard.
It's 2 o'clock, yes. Yeah. But it's a good conversation. I love this. Yeah, go.
Because when you were in Shetland, you went around and you asked people their opinion on these matters, didn't you?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Yeah, I always wonder. I mean, of course, I'm an outsider and I walk around and people tell me what they want to tell me. Who am I? But your example of Shetland Islanders talking to Faroe Islanders about what can and cannot be done and what would be working for their community, what might work for you. I think that's an interesting thing, and I'm not sure whether that's happening more, but in my neck of the woods, the 3 island communities around Australia, so Christmas Island, Norfolk Island, and Cocos Island, very different communities, but for the first time ever, people in these communities are getting together and they're discovering how much central government is having different rules for different islands, and it can be very inspiring for one community to hear that the next community is having success in achieving a certain autonomy, getting certain services, sorting a certain problem out. And they say, we have the same problem and we haven't been able to sort it out. How did you do it? That sort of conversations among
one of the interesting examples that we don't have time to go into just now, which is quite different from the Shetland example we looked at earlier, is in the Hebrides, where I am. 85% of the population now live on community-owned land, and so owning the land gives you the capital and the clout to say we're going to do this way. We're going to make housing available, land available for housing, or we're going to reinvest the turbine income in these particular things and not those particular things. And that's created a tension between that and local government, because local government is obviously got an eye on what can we get rid of, how can we save money, if we can pass this problem over of the collecting our rubbish bins or policing some aspect to the community. And the community were saying, well, hang on, that's why we pay our taxes. So this is not either or. This is an additional thing that we have that you don't have, and so that is going to be definitely an issue to watch in the near future, I think.
Yeah, very important point, Frank. Land ownership in most islands in the Pacific is communal, and they have been under pressure since colonial times to have individual land titles. There's a radical pushback in all territories, New Zealand controlled, French controlled, US controlled. It just is not going to happen. Communities, they can see what's coming after that. So yeah, it's a very interesting and important angle that's growing in importance. Adele gave a bit of a comment there. Aha. Well, yes, that's typical. You're being required to submit the locally generated energy to the central national grid. It's a bit like the Australian government raising the airport taxes when the Norfolk Islanders wanted to have their own airline to New Zealand. Just would make it impossible for you. You shall be dependent upon us. Yeah, this great example, Adele, and again, it's an area of conflict.
It is, yeah. No easy answer. I would just, well, last comment there, just for you, Gerard, to note. This is Ro saying, does negotiating with metropole individual agreements depend on current geopolitical situation in the area?
The answer is yes.
Yes, and there we go. Yes, that's a good answer. So, thank you very much indeed, Gerard, and thanks very much for coping with the technological difficulties at the beginning. As I say, there were many more people who were hoping to attend, but I've been dealing with emails, so there has been a problem. But thank you for letting us record this, and it will go on our INS Institute for Northern Studies YouTube channel, and it will garner more responses and more watchers over time. Our last seminars from last semester have been increasing, footfall, as it were, because it's all online. And again, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and experience of the Pacific Islands and bringing to our attention some of the features that do reflect on our lives here in the Scottish Islands as well. And it shows that we should be not just looking to the Faroe Islands for inspiration, but we should be looking much further afield. And we'll let you get to your bed now. Thank you very much, Gerard.
Thank you all. Good luck. Talk again. Bye-bye.
Bye now.